Welcome to this chess video, everyone. We continue our free coaching playlist, and our viewer here has sent in a game where they have played against an international master, and more impressively, this was an in-person game. It starts with knight f3, and then f5, d4, knight f6, c4, and then e6. And so this is the Dutch defense, just a different move order of the classical variation. There's definitely some overlap and also some sidelines, but I would say that the three main variations of the Dutch defense are the classical variation, with the pawns here. You'll probably play for d6 with the pawn, and then you'll be pushing to e5, trying to gain a little bit more central space. The second option being the Stonewall Dutch, pawn to c6, and also pawn to d5. Creating this iconic formation in the stone wall. And then lastly, instead of e6, they could also fianchetto with g6 and bishop g7, and that would be the Leningrad variation. Now all three of those has slightly different plans, despite being a Dutch defense, but let's stick with the variation that we have here. Knight c3 is a good developing move, bishop to b4, and now this move actually reminds me of a very similar game that I played. This was an online game against National Master Sam Copeland, and I got crushed in that game. The point of bishop to b4 is that they're adding pressure to this knight. You'll most likely play pawn to b6 at some point, bishop to b7, and you're controlling this entire diagonal, but especially the e4 square. And as a general rule in the Dutch defense, usually if white can play pawn to e4 themselves, then they're usually pretty happy to do so. Bishop d2 is played to break the pin, black chose to castle, white plays e3, and here comes the b6 move that I mentioned. White plays bishop to e2, which of course helps reinforce this knight after this bishop comes to the long diagonal. It's a perfectly fine move. I would probably slightly prefer bishop to d3 just because it controls a little bit more of the center and also helps control this e4 square that we mentioned was very important in this opening. But bishop to e2 is fine as well. Of course, black chooses to fianchetto, and now we get the first inaccuracy according to the computer, which was queen to c2. Now it's a very common spot for this queen in positions similar to this, but in this particular position, the engine slightly prefers rook to c1. Now it's pretty clear that rook to c1 is a very good move. If we look at white's pawn structure, this reminds me a lot of the queen's gambit declined. And you'll know in a lot of those variations, the queen will go to c2, the bishop goes to d3, and the rook usually goes to c1, so that way when there's a pawn trade on d5, white will have a half-open file with the queen and the rook. I don't think queen c2 is a bad move, but it might be slightly early because black may play bishop to e4 at some point, when black would not be able to do so if this was the queen's gambit, because in a queen's gambit declined, black would still have a pawn on d5. On returning to the game, d6 was played, then pawn to h3, and really I think just simply castling is the better move. But I do have to commend the ambition, because the idea with h3 was to play g4. And we can see the computer doesn't really love g4, but it had a pretty decent idea to it. The very obvious is, of course, if we capture on f5, rook to g1 might put pressure on black's king. But let's discuss a little bit why g4 is not exactly best here. Now remember I mentioned the Dutch stonewall earlier. So in the stonewall defense, black will have pawns on the squares I've highlighted in red, and you'll notice that from there, this bishop does not have control over e4. And so in that opening, sometimes you can actually get away with playing pawn g4, basically break down this pillar that black has on f5, and slowly chip away at the center that black holds with the stonewall formation. And very similarly, black will have a pawn on d5 and the queen's gambit declined, as mentioned, after this pawn trade, and once again, black does not have access to the e4 square. Now after g4 in the game, bishop captures c3 was the correct first move, but after here, with the knight no longer guarding e4, the correct move is actually bishop to e4. And white can't really interpose with the bishop because then they'll drop the knight. Again, something that would not be a problem if this pawn was back on g2 supporting the knight. But instead, black played a very logical follow-up, it's just slightly inaccurate. And that follow-up was knight to e4, which in a lot of similar structures is a really good move, because this f-pawn really helps support that knight, and it's actually a fairly annoying piece for white to try and get rid of. We have g captures f5, but now here comes a little bit of a nuance. The engine actually prefers knight captures c3 because it is winning the bishop pair, which is very unusual from a human perspective, because then you're giving up your knight that looked really good on e4. But in trading off the bishop pair, black can now recapture on f5 with a rook, and black seems to be doing slightly better here. In fact, they still have control over e4, thanks to their bishop on b7. Instead of that, the real game went e captures f5, trying to secure the knight, but it's really important that black tried to take away white's bishop here. I'm repeating the importance of this a lot, but if you want to know why a bishop pair is so valuable, you can take a look at this chess video here, which is the very first game that really left an impression on me on the importance of the bishop pair. Now the problem with anchoring the knight here was actually really well exploited in this game, so congratulations to white because they found pawn to d5, and the computer says this is best. I'd like to give that the great icon, so I'll manually give it here. Now is really kind of their last chance to capitalize by capturing the bishop pair while they still have that option. And if they do so, then they can start pushing the f-pawn and trying to expose white's uncastled king. The position is about equal, but it's a little tricky for white if they're not careful. Now instead of grabbing the bishop pair by knight captures c3, they try and bring their other knight to f6. It actually gives white a slight chance to improve their position by playing bishop to d4, with the sole purpose of maintaining the bishop pair. In the game, it was rook to g1, but the problem with this is it once again gives black the opportunity to take the bishop. And now they don't pass up the opportunity. White captures back, and now the game continues. Queen to e7. Objectively, white's best move here is actually just to castle queenside. The rooks may even double on the g file, but that's a much more long-term thing. Instead, knight d4 was played in the game, but this allows black to play knight e4 themselves, attacking white's queen. Now black can get active with their own queen. Notice they have a lot of pressure on f2, but also the h3 pawn. And so bishop d3 is played in the game, which I actually really like this move. It's kind of a clever way of defending f2, because of the queen here, not minding to give up the h3 pawn. But the next move is actually really difficult to see unless you're an engine. White had a really strong idea of knight to e6, and so the strong idea that black had was bishop back to c8, with the only purpose of being able to capture the knight when it lands there. But this looks a bit strange because the bishop sitting here on c8 really traps in this a8 rook. So black played the human move instead, which is develop the rook first and then maybe play bishop back to c8. But now knight e6 comes in, and that's a very strong outpost. Rook f7 saves the rook, but now white can capture black's strong knight. It's not a big deal trading away the bishop since we've already lost that first bishop. F captures was slightly more accurate because it opens up the f file. Remember, the queen would still be on h4. Now the queen trade isn't bad, and the engine actually likes it for white. I would probably consider castling queenside because then it connects the rooks. You may double rooks on the g file, but in the game the decision was made not to trade queens, and so queen c3. Keep in mind there is a lot of pressure here on the g7 square. And so the way to try and minimize that pressure was actually queen to e5. Perfect interference, don't mind the queen trades, and black is holding completely well here. Instead of that, there was a rare blunder that was made, rook e to e7, and this loses material to the knight fork, which was actually found in the game. Black of course saves the queen, white cashes in grabbing the rook, but now white castled queenside, which although I liked it before, now I think it's not so great. There was a big deal to castle earlier because remember we had the knight on e4 putting a lot of pressure on f2 with the queen, and so that king was definitely in danger. But now there's a lot less danger that's on the board. That knight is gone and the queen by itself is not going to do a lot. And so I would prefer to guard this pawn. And keep in mind that after you castle, you're also potentially dropping f2. We're up 2 points of material, but that doesn't mean we have to give back any material so easily. So I like rook to g3. It guards the h pawn and it guards the f2 pawn by interference. And then after black moves, then white can castle. They can probably double on the g file and they're slightly better. Don't forget that the queen also adds pressure to g7 in addition to both rooks. But okay, castling right away, white is still slightly better. Bishop to c8, and the engine doesn't love it, but again, I don't mind this move. It's actually another human move, which realizes that bishop was not looking at much on d5. Best, according to the engine, was queen captures f2, trying to get back some material. Rook g3 was found now. Black pushes the pawn. There's trades on f4. And in the heat of the moment, the check was blocked with the rook, which unfortunately gives back the entire advantage because now bishop captures h3. Note that queen to e3 wasn't a good block because then queen captures c4 is a check. Blocking on d2 is possible, but I think here most simple is actually just move the king to b1. It's slightly safer there. And if you're worried about another check, then the king to a1 in the corner actually helps shield it from a lot of checks, and I think white's king is actually really safe. And if instead of bishop f5 check, let's say black tries to get back one of their two pawns, then I think developing the rook to e1, of course defended by white's queen, or even doubling on the g file are both good options that white has. But unfortunately this move is played, and then bishop captures h3 is found. White is up by one pawn, but it's actually pretty tricky, and black has compensation for it. Rook d2 is a clever try to try and unpin this first rook. Going back here, the computer actually likes rook to d4, chasing away the black queen, but this was a creative try. Back to d7, and then the game continued like this. We go a few more moves ahead, and things are still pretty close to equal, but practically speaking, it's actually pretty dangerous because this h-pawn is really close to promoting. I can tell the white probably felt that pressure, and so after h3, white chose to trade rooks. But now the way to try and stop that pawn is you have to bring the rook back to e1. And now pushing h2 would be a mistake because rook to h1, and long term you're going to get your queen over here and win black's overextended pawn. Instead of rook to e1, in the real game it was played this check, probably trying to bring the queen back to h1, but king g8 and black's king is much safer. Note that this diagonal they are slightly weak on actually is kind of shielded by white's pawns. And connect 4 is not really helping us here. Especially important is the d5 check being blocked by that pawn. And so with black's king fairly safe, the real threat here is this, and how do you stop that pawn from promoting? Queen h1 tries to hang on, but having a queen tied to defense just to stop one pawn probably gives a slight advantage for black. And so in the game, rook to e1 was tried to try and swing the rook over, but unfortunately this loses to a one-move fork, which was found in the game, and this is where resignation happened. That was a really well played game against a really tough player, and try and show some of the highlights where I think improvements could have been made. Now unfortunately, the really creative attempt with g4 here was probably the moment where I think it was really lost. It was a really good idea to try and open up the g file, but bishop to e4 was the clincher that was missed in the game. So if you consider ideas like g4 against the f5 pawn, you'll usually want a black pawn on d5 or something else to interfere with a bishop landing on e4. The real game had the knight land on e4 instead. But that brings us to the other instructional point of the bishop pair, and how white probably should have tried to save this bishop on c3. The rest of the game was really just nuances and tactical tricks against white's king. It's very natural that after white had this fork here, there was probably a lot of excitement and maybe even a bit of nervousness against a much stronger player because it looks like we're winning material, and indeed we are. But in positions like that, you sometimes have to kind of switch gears and then try and be patient. And so we can afford to play a move like rook g3. Sometimes it's hard to play that because you just won material, you're trying to really keep up the attack. But when you're up material and wanting to trade to an endgame, you don't have to keep attacking. And so your mindset should shift because the position is shifted. Black's king is pretty safe here, and white doesn't really have enough pieces to attack. But overall, this was a really well thought out game. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. I'll see you in the next chess video.